Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about 13 Days. So let's jump right into our movie synopsis. Released in 2000, 13 Days is a political thriller all about the Cuban Missile Crisis that took place in October of 1962 during the Cold War. At the beginning of the movie, we see a U-2 spy plane from the United States take some aerial photographs that reveal missiles being constructed by the Soviet Union in Cuba. And those missiles are capable of delivering a nuclear strike to a huge part of the United States where millions and millions of people live. And they're able to deliver that strike with only a few minutes of warning. So we see Bruce Greenwood's version of President John F. Kennedy consulting with several high-ranking military and political officials that include Kevin Costner's version of Special Assistant Kenneth O'Donnell and JFK's brother, the Attorney General at the time, Robert F. Kennedy. He's played by Stephen Culp in the movie. Focused on staving off the nuclear threat, we see the Joint Chiefs of Staff advocating for an airstrike to take out the missiles before they can get them assembled. But O'Donnell and the two Kennedy brothers fear an attack by the military that will kill both Cuban and Soviet soldiers will start a war with the Soviet Union. And that will spiral into a conflict that will inevitably drag in allies from both sides, possibly leading to another world war. In an unlikely turn of events in the movie, an ABC News correspondent mentions a possible back-channel communication with a Soviet operative that he's used as a source before. That Soviet operative might be able to get a message from Kennedy directly to the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. As tensions escalate and the world is made aware of the situation through a public speech delivered by President Kennedy, both diplomatic solutions and communications between Kennedy and Khrushchev continue. Near the end of the movie, we see another American U-2 spy plane, but this time the plane is shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Between the loss of American life at the hand of the Soviets, along with a ticking clock on the nuclear weapons being operational, President Kennedy is forced to put a deadline on a diplomatic solution. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, I'm excited to welcome Joshua Donohue back to the podcast. Joshua is an adjunct professor of history at both Suffolk County Community College and Farmingdale State College. And Josh is working on a few more projects about his uncle's service in the Vietnam War, as well as working on a new book that he'll tell us about at the end of the episode. But before we chat with Joshua, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true. And that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, President Kennedy ordered a halt of all U.S. nuclear tests during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Number 2, White House conversations were recorded and used for the book that the movie is based on. Number 3, Kennedy and Khrushchev really did communicate outside of official channels. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is a lie, and I've got the answer right here in the envelope that will open at the end of the episode to reveal the answer and see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Joshua Donohue about the historical accuracy of 13 Days. We'll start today by looking at the movie's depiction of the Cuban Missile Crisis from an overall perspective. So if you were to give 13 Days a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
I would say 13 Days gets a solid B. And I'll get a little bit more into why that is towards the end of it. So the film itself is based on a book called The Kennedy Tapes by Ernest May and Philip Zelikow. Not to be confused with the actual book 13 Days by Robert Kennedy, who was obviously, the president's brother and had a major role during the missile crisis. So the book itself consists of the actual recorded conversations which took place throughout the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bruce Greenwood, the lead actor, I'd say the lead actor, but the really lead character of JFK, gives an impressive performance as the president. Stephen Culp plays his brother, Robert Kennedy. I was particularly struck by his performance. It's not easier for actors, I'm sure, to nail that Boston accent the way he does in the film, but he really does a great job there. And of course, the film's central character, really the primary character, of course, Kevin Costner plays Ken O'Donnell. And he's always been good to me. I've always liked his work. He's playing historical figures, great Elliot Ness in The Untouchables, which is a great film. plays Jim Garrison, and obviously a JFK-related film, JFK in 1991. He portrays Ken O'Donnell in the film, who is JFK's what's termed special assistant. And throughout the crisis, the decision-making was made from the White House, and there, from unbeknownst to those who were present, there were hidden tape recorders capturing all of the deliberations, word for word. So before becoming president, JFK had made use of a recording device called the dictaphone, mostly for dictating letters and notes. So in the summer of 1962, shortly before the crisis, he would ask Secret Service agent Robert Bauch to place concealed recording devices in the cabinet room, the Oval Office, the study, the library, and the mansion. And without explaining why, Bauch basically obtained these Tandberg reel-to-reel tape recorders, these high-quality machines for the period from the Army Signal Corps. And he had placed these machines in the basement of the West Wing, in the White House, and in the room reserved for storing private presidential files. So he would also place another in the basement of the executive mansion. So the West Wing machines were connected by these different wired microphones into the cabinet room, 2 in the Oval Office. Those in the cabinet room on the outside wall were placed behind drapes. I mean, they were everywhere. And they would be activated by a switch that the president would activate, which would be easily mistaken for sort of a buzzer to buzz somebody into a room. So of the microphones in the Oval Office, his was an actual knee hole in the president's desk, and the other concealed in a coffee table across the room. So this is like CIA, type stuff we're talking here. Each could be turned on and off with a single sort of inconspicuous button. So this book is a collection of the transcripts that were, based upon the actual conversations in the Oval Office. So like the film itself, the book sort of forces it to stay well within the confines of historical accuracy, since, again, it's verbatim in many scenes, and every single tense moment is captured during these high-level negotiations. And the film also does a great job with representing the characters and their individual personalities, and there are many of them, very strong personalities, as we see in the film. So, of course, Ken O'Donnell and what JFK does when he forms his cabinet, when he becomes president in 1960, and really takes the office in 1961. Ken O'Donnell, is a special assistant. He was a bombardier in World War II, flew 30 missions in B-17s over Europe. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, was a colonel in World War II, serving in the Burma Theater. You have the chairman of the Army Joint Chiefs, Maxwell Taylor. He was commanding general of the 101st Airborne in World War II. He's mentioned in Band of Brothers, as well as earlier in the war with the 82nd Airborne Division. He was involved in Normandy landings, Operation Market Garden, and really all of them share Kennedy's vision on a global perspective on World War II and the lessons learned from that. And that's why he surrounds himself with these advisors. Kennedy, of course, the hero of PT-109, when his PT boat's rammed by a Japanese destroyer and saves a number of his crew in the process. And McGeorge Bundy, JFK's national security advisor, an aide to Rear Admiral Kirk. He was aboard the USS Augusta during the D-Day landings in June 6, 1944. And another character, which we'll all come familiar with, Curtis LeMay, who was Strategic Air Command head during the 1950s. He commanded the 305th Bombardment Group, the 3rd Air Division in the European Theater of Operations, also served in China, India, Burma Theater, and later, of course, put in charge of B-29 forces against the Japanese later in the war. So all of these different individuals had complex personalities, different tolerances, different attitudes, and Kennedy was faced with all of this at once. And again, the lessons learned by all of them through World War II, they had been through Munich, Pearl Harbor, the battles against the Axis, of course, Hitler and the Japanese, and of course, Mussolini. They'd been through the early years of the Cold War and the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, the Iron Curtain, containment, the Korean War, McCarthyism, Suez, Hungary, Sputnik, the nuclear tests that began during the 1950s. So you're setting the stage for, these negotiations over these 13 days, and you have the right people making these decisions and some other individuals not making the correct decisions. And Kennedy is again faced with a lot of this. And again, he navigates this pretty effectively.
Yeah, it's something that I don't think we think about a lot when it comes to movies is in the historical context of things. You mentioning, a lot of these people that had World War II experience even, and we're talking about the Cold War, which I think we think a lot of like, okay, that was right after World War II and stuff, but you also don't seem to, at least when I'm watching a movie like this, you know that there's tensions in the air, but you don't even think about the tensions that were there before any of these events were even happening in the movie. And you're thinking of all these World War II vets, and they had to have things in the back of their mind that are never going to be mentioned in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, that's that's one of the motivations why Kennedy surrounds himself in what's termed the Irish Mafia. You have McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Ken O'Donnell. You have these are his closest people who have been with him throughout his tenure in politics following the Second World War. So he trusts his advisors. He knows he's going to get sound advice from them, and they have obviously the country's best interest at heart. So it's pretty remarkable. I mean, considering the fact that not only is Kennedy dealing with what seemingly could be an all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union, but he has to deal with all these clashing personalities, and also to mention the fact that, and you see it in the film too, Kennedy's dealing with some ailments, and of course he has a major back injury as a result of the PT-109 incident. And he also has Addison's disease, which he has been suffering from really since his youth. And you see some of those scenes where he's kind of limbering, he's kind of tense a little bit and strains at certain points. So I like those little details in the film as well.
Well, if we go back to the movie and kind of how it sets up the Cuban Missile Crisis, I know we mentioned it, we kind of talked a little bit about it already, but the way the movie sets up this version of history is there's an American U-2 spy plane that's taking photos over Cuba, and these pictures then get analyzed at the very beginning of the movie to reveal that they're SS-4 Sandal missiles. And in a briefing with President Kennedy, we find out that these missiles are capable of striking cities as far as Washington, D.C. in just under 5 minutes time. So basically, at a moment's notice, the Soviet Union can kill, movie mentions, like 80 million Americans, and the missiles will be installed within 10 to 14 days, meaning that there's this deadline that the Americans are figuring out how to deal with this situation. Is that a pretty good explanation of why the Cuban Missile Crisis was such a major crisis?
Yeah, it really was, because it's exactly what you just said. They had such a narrow window of time to figure out what they were going to do. And they knew that they were dealing with much longer missiles than what had been, and I'll get into that in a moment. But yeah, that's really the focus throughout the crisis is, and Maxwell Taylor was really the one that pushes that issue. Mr. President, we are running out of time. The window of opportunity is closing, and you can just feel the pressure. It's just, you can cut it with a knife. But the opening sequences of the film are particularly striking in giving you, the viewer, a preview of what nuclear Armageddon would look like, with the actual test footage of these nuclear explosions, missiles launching en masse. And again, it's downright frightening. Armageddon, again, this is what it would look like. And we would only have mere minutes to prepare, if anything, for that, especially when you think not only this, but how far the technology had come since the end of World War II, how much more destructive these weapons had come in a very short period of time. It really makes the bombs of Nagasaki and Hiroshima look, small. And during the first part of October, President Kennedy starts to receive intelligence of unceasing streams of Soviet military equipment now reaching Cuba. And the CIA informs him that Cuba was now operating the latest MiG models, the MiG-21, which were capable also of carrying nuclear weapons and nuclear armed air-to-surface missiles. So on October 9th, a U.S. Navy reconnaissance plane would bring back evidence of Soviet cargo ships carrying IL-28 bombers, which were twin-engine bombers with a range of about 750 miles. So these IL-28s were known to carry nuclear and conventional ordnance, and were actually of an old design, were being phased out of the Soviet Air Force. But these were not the offensive weapons which Kennedy had warned in his public statements of September 4th and September 13th. He and his advisors agreed, as McGeorge Bundy would put it, the surface-to-surface missiles would be the quote-unquote turning point. So the news about the IL-28s did cause him to authorize U-2 flights over Cuba. For nearly a month, Director of Central Intelligence John McCone had pressed for such flights to take place, fearing that, on the other hand, Dean Rusk would say, and others would say, the U-2 would eventually be detected or shot down as over the Soviet Union in 1960, recalling, of course, the downing of American U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers during the last year of President Dwight David Eisenhower's administration. That particular incident had been a severe setback between Eisenhower and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. So the fallout over the U-2 downing in 1960 resulted in canceling the Paris summit, and they were scheduled to discuss the ongoing situation in a divided Germany, the possibility of an arms control agreement or a test ban treaty, and a relaxation of tensions between the superpowers. But the Gary Powers incident basically nixes the summit, and the very first meeting following the discovery of the missiles on the ground in Cuba from the U-2 spy plane would take place on Tuesday, October 16th, around 11:50 in the morning.
Okay, that was going to be one of my other questions. You're talking about why they even had spy planes, U-2 planes flying over Cuba to begin with. The movie doesn't even talk about that. It's like they're just doing it as part of their routine, right?
Yeah. Is the U-2? I'll get more into it in a moment. It was an important tool, and we had known that once it was developed and put into service, that you needed to get. Obviously before the age of satellites and spy satellites, you needed to get aerial reconnaissance from much higher altitudes out of the range of surface-to-air missiles. So during that time, it was important to get that kind of reconnaissance.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, in the movie, when they find out about the missiles that are in Cuba, it kind of lays out the options that President Kennedy is given by his advisors in the room. So there's three main options. One, they can do a surgical airstrike to take out the missiles themselves. Two, they can do a larger airstrike against all of the air defenses there, this being a strike in Cuba. Or three, they can do a ground invasion of Cuba, or maybe a combination of them. You have an airstrike first to take out the missiles. They talk about all those kind of things too. And then the invasion into Cuba to avoid any more missiles being brought in. And then later in the movie, the advisors kind of play out how they think everything's going to happen. First, JFK would demand the Soviets remove the missiles. They're going to refuse, of course. So then JFK is going to order the airstrike, followed by the invasion. There's going to be fighting, but the U.S. probably won't have trouble overwhelming the Soviet forces there in Cuba to deactivate the missiles. But then that's going to trigger something else, as the Soviets are going to retaliate, most likely in Berlin is what they say in the movie. And then when the Soviets attack Berlin, the U.S. is going to be forced to honor treaties, and that's basically going to trigger out all-out war. Is the movie accurately portraying the options and then the possible chain of events that Kennedy was debating at the start of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah, it really was. They were laying out every option imaginable. And in the book, The Kennedy Tapes, each conversation is going over every single scenario, every single possibility. And even with the photographs that the U-2 spy plane brings back, the next day, October 15th, experts at the CIA's National Photographic Intelligence Center, the NPIC, were looking over these photos from the U-2's flight from the previous day, and now seeing images of these missiles that were much longer than standard surface-to-air missiles. They began to leaf through the files, as you see in the film, to try and compare which version of these missiles they have. And as they're going through them, They came up with the perfect match in the form of these medium-range ballistic missiles, as you mentioned, the SS-4 Sandal family. So as far as the first negotiations as what they're going to do, what options they're going to have, Berlin was at the center of really every major decision in some way, shape, or form. In every hypothetical, okay, we do this, what are they going to do in Berlin? We do this, what are they going to do in Berlin? So the situation there at the time was as tense as it was really following the end of the Second World War. The Berlin Wall had gone up in 1961, effectively dividing the city in two. And these early meetings between Kennedy's and advisors would set the tone for a very high level of discussion that was going to take place over the next 13 days. So Arthur Lundahl, who was the head of the NPIC, would pass the news to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. With the news then reaching Robert McNamara, he then reaches and meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and dozens of lower level officials. The group then reviews plans to conduct massive airstrikes against targets in Cuba with a larger scale invasion of Cuba by the sea. So McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor, would find out about these developments, and he gets a cryptic response following the discovery of the SS-4, saying those things we've been worrying about, quote unquote, as it looks like we've really got something now. So Kennedy at the time was returning from a trip from New York State and arrived in Washington later that evening. So Bundy doesn't reveal the news to him until the next day, a decision actually which Kennedy supports. Bundy thought that he was going to need a good night's sleep over the next number of days and weeks because there were going to be some tense times over the next number of days and weeks. So when Kennedy was informed of the news, he has Bundy secretly round up officials later on that morning, not to arouse any suspicion. Kennedy resumes his normal schedule, meeting with NASA astronaut Raleigh Schirra, followed by an appointment with Kenny O'Donnell in his office. And O'Donnell later recalls, quote unquote, "You still think the fuss about Cuba is unimportant?" And Archie Kennedy says that, and O'Donnell responds, "Absolutely. The voters won't give a damn about Cuba." So little does he know, following Sidney Graybill, Marshall Carter's description of the missiles to Kennedy's and advisors, that first meeting you see in the film, he has a conversation with McGeorge Bundy and Robert McNamara on the subject of the U-2 flights. He states his case that he recommends additional flights over Cuba, at which point the president calls on Dean Rusk. And in the film, Dean Rusk gives his thoughts on the unfolding crisis and makes a quote saying, "If we permit the introduction to a Soviet satellite nation in our hemisphere, the diplomatic consequences will be too terrible to contemplate. The Russians are trying to show the world that they can do whatever they want, whenever they want, and we're powerless to stop them. So if they succeed, at which point Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who was, of course, the younger brother of the president, makes the quote, "It'll be like Munich all over again." And Rusk replies, "Yes, the aggressor will become more aggressive and the Soviets will be emboldened to push us even harder." And if you look in the film, at that very moment, there's a look that RFK looks up and sees his brother, and he looks back at him. It's a little moment, but there's a deeper meaning there. And Munich would capture an even deeper meaning for the Kennedys, especially for their father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., played a role in the event. Munich wasn't a single event, as one might suggest, but a series of events following the Munich conference with Adolf Hitler in 1938. In order to appease Nazi Germany, they're taking the Sudetenland. So Joseph Kennedy was the ambassador to Britain under FDR's administration, both in cables to the State Department and in speeches and interviews. Kennedy backs Britain's appeasement policy to Germany and continued to do so well into World War II, arguing that Britain had the right to conciliate with Hitler in light of these harsh peace treaties imposed upon Germany at the end of the First World War. So Joe Kennedy labels himself as an appeaser and an isolationist, and JFK would long carry this burden of this legacy. So going back to the proceedings, McNamara then begins his assessment of the findings and outlines his course of action. Comes up with two propositions. One is to conduct an airstrike against the missile installations, and he wants to do so prior to the approximate time that the missiles will become operational. And he further explains if they do become operational before any proposed airstrike, that there is no guarantee that all of the missile sites will be eliminated. And the missiles now will have a radius of between 600 to 1,000 miles from Cuba. His second proposition is that the United States commits itself to an airstrike in Cuba that will not only be directed at the missile sites, but also the airfields and any potential other aircraft which could pose a threat, also striking potential nuclear storage sites. And he then points out that this will be a large-scale strike, which estimates Cuban losses of between a few hundred to into the thousands. So he outlines a plan of invasion of both air and sea, followed by the airstrikes, or following the airstrikes, I should say. He then defers to Maxwell Taylor, and Taylor agrees that a surprise attack, outlining all of the above and hitting these missile installations. He reiterates that timing is everything, and the missiles need to be hit before they become ours.
Wow, yeah, they really did have a lot of different plans. A lot of what if scenarios. It sounds like they were working through a lot of those.
Yeah, because they really had to figure out what the Soviet Union was going to do in every possible way. If we do this, what are they going to do? If we do that and do this, what are they going to do? And there's just that what if, almost like a war game like scenario playing out in the Oval Office. So he and his advisors have quite a bit of work to do, but they do have one thing on their side. They don't know. They realize they know something that the Russians don't think the Americans know yet. And that's obviously going to play out much later on in the film.
Well, you mentioned Munich, and I appreciate you kind of explaining what that was. There's another few things that the movie mentions here and there, and it kind of assumes that we already know. While Kennedy and his advisors are considering the options, they mentioned the Bay of Pigs, and then there's a mention of Ortsack, which the movie also points out is just Castro spelled backwards, as if they didn't even really hide that operation name very well. But can you explain how some of these other things that the movie is mentioning fit into the overall picture?
So by around mid-October of 1962, the Cold War had intensified in unforeseen ways, and Cuba was a long virtually held colony of the United States and had effectively moved into the Soviet orbit. You have the revolution in 1959 with the overthrow of the dictator Fulgencio Batista, the emergence, of course, of dictator Fidel Castro as the leading figure, of course, prime minister. He's hand in hand with Khrushchev, and they are forging ties, again, which still exist in some way, shape, or form today. So this emergence of a new communist regime, becoming the first in the Western Hemisphere, is a big deal, especially, of course, for the United States, the geopolitical sort of context. And the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, which takes place in April of 1961, had only exacerbated tensions between Russia and the U.S. and brought Cuba even closer ties to Russia. And Kennedy has a memorable quote. He was a terrific speaker, and we'll get to the brains behind that and the true center of it. But he has a quote from after the defeat of the Bay of Pigs. He says, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." And I just always latched onto that quote because even in the face of defeat and just the political disaster from the outside in and with the inside out, from his political advisors, from people who at the time didn't think Kennedy was up to the task of this. He's too young. He doesn't have the experience. He's too cocky. He's arrogant. He's immature. He was getting all these things thrown at him. So the Bay of Pigs affair had many consequences which would loom over the missile crisis. Again, it damaged Kennedy's standing among many political circles and beyond. Cuban exiles never quite forgave him for his decision not to reinforce the invasion by air, no support from the Air Force or the Navy. And there's a moment where you see Bundy and Taylor and the other chiefs talking to Dean Acheson about the Munich effect as they're walking out in the hallway and whether he's up to the task of handling this and a crisis of this magnitude, more or less, and in varying degrees. Also the common verdict among senior military officers, particularly in the Air Force and the Navy, as well as the CIA's clandestine service awareness. So more closely consequence related to the affair was the development of the inner circle of Kennedy's advisors of the animus against Castro. JFK and especially Bobby Kennedy longed for some redeeming opportunity to get back for the failed Bay of Pigs. And this was also a time where Kennedy authorizes the development of special warfare operations, the Green Berets, the Navy SEALs. These groups meant to be deployed to hotspots all over the world at a moment's notice. So Kennedy would organize a new set of covert operations against Castro called Operation Mongoose, which was meant to destabilize the Castro regime by launching operations inside of Cuba to undermine his position and with the goal of removal of power. So some even looked to assassinate Castro. Under constant badgering by Bobby Kennedy, the CIA came up with a number of what veteran intelligence officer Richard Helms termed nutty schemes. And this explains that tense meeting that Bobby's presiding over, where he's saying, no, 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 we need to come up with more options and demanding to come up with more ideas. And McCone, the CIA director, calls out Bobby Kennedy and says to him, well, you really weren't saying all these options when you were at the CIA and with your pals there, telling you, okay, we got to get Castro out and get rid of him now. So he has that moment where he sits down and sort of throws his glasses down and he just doesn't even know what to say at that point. So Taylor gives him that surprised look, as you see in the film, sits down, he throws his glasses and kind of is just kind of exhausted at that point. So Maxwell Taylor then explains to him and the chiefs and concurs with McNamara's assessment that the importance of destroying the missiles before they become operational is important before they must prove a full-scale invasion of Cuba 8 days later. And also you start to hear the first chimings of suggesting a blockade or a quarantine of the island, which will, of course, be the primary strategy which plays out there.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but in the movie's timeline, you mentioned this briefly, and the Americans know about the missiles, but then when JFK meets with the Russian diplomat, he doesn't let on how much the Americans actually know. And then we see that the Soviets just flat out deny there being missiles in Cuba. They insist the presence in Cuba is for defensive purposes only. Is it true that the Soviets were denying missiles in Cuba when the Americans knew that they had it? And we could see it, well, in the movie, we can see them actually actively working on setting them up.
That's absolutely true. And the decision, as I mentioned earlier, from the get-go was made to keep President Kennedy's schedule as normal and routine as possible in order to prevent the media, and really to causing a public panic across the nation. So during that first meeting, Dean Rusk will bring up the issue with Kennedy's meeting with Soviet Ambassador Andrei Gromyko. Gromyko's request to see Kennedy on Thursday, October 18th. Rusk's quote to the president is, "It may be some interest to know what he says, if he even says anything." So there's that idea of going into this meeting, do not let on at all that we know what's going on there. We want to sort of play this as a chess game, as really the Cold War, for the most part, is. So Rusk will also bring up another key issue, which will come into play later on during the later phases of the crisis. Maxwell Taylor brings it up on a meeting on October 18th. He suggests that there would be advantages in not disclosing American knowledge of the missiles in order to get Gromyko to basically lie and keep up a pattern of denial. So Russ then suggests that Kennedy words it more in terms of a sort of deep disturbance about the provocation in Cuba, quote unquote, and then adds that Ambassador Dobrynin say that there weren't any offensive weapons in Cuba, but even Dobrynin may not know either. So Robert Kennedy then brings up the subject of the United States missiles in Turkey, and JFK asks how many there are, and George Bundy responds 15, plus nuclear-equipped aircraft. And Turkey and the issue of the Jupiter missiles there will also be a major bargaining chip, which will come out throughout the proceedings. So the meeting between Kennedy and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko takes place at 5 p.m. on the 18th of October. The meeting lasts until about 7:15 p.m. Gromyko emphasizes the need to settle the Berlin issue and then repeats his promise the Soviets would do nothing before the November elections in the United States, warning that they could take possible steps at this point to bring the Berlin problem to a conclusion, whatever that meant, and then describe the Western presence in Berlin as a sort of rotten tooth that must be pulled out. So Gromyko then complains that the U.S. threats against Cuba and the Soviet Union that the Soviets were only training the Cubans in the use of defensive weapons, as you mentioned. So the Soviet delegation then responds by saying, I assure the president once more of the policy of the Soviet Union always has and always will be directed at strengthening peace, the elimination of differences in relations between all countries, first of all, the relations between the USSR and the United States. And of course, the Soviet Union wants to have peace and friendship for all mankind. So in regards to the Cuban issue, it's not been invented by the Soviet Union. It's regards to the signing of the German peace treaty, a normalization of relations in West Berlin in regards to all other issues and two separate issues for each country. And the policy is peace, friendship, and the removing of differences by peaceful means. So Kennedy then recalls his advisors back to the White House. And in another example of the Kennedy's administration and their hopes of keeping up with business as usual under that guise, they do not hold a meeting in the West Wing of the White House, since that meeting would be taking place after hours. This was done out of fear that reporters would notice and suspect that something was off. So to the press and the public, United States, the president was scheduled to fly to Cleveland on the 19th and then to Illinois for speeches and activities in Springfield and Chicago. You see the meeting with Mayor Daley there. And of course, in the film, Ken O'Donnell tells Pierre Salinger, the president is going to have a cold the next day. And O'Donnell then is feeling the pressure from the press contact, as you see as well, where he confronts him in the elevator and Eddie rips the door open and basically backs him into a corner and says, you're not going to release that. No way. And there must have been that pressure in the media to, keep shut, because if you made an enemy within the political circle in Kennedy's administration, your career might be in jeopardy.
I'm curious about the element of speaking publicly about it, because that is something that, as I was watching the movie, it seems like JFK and his inner circle are really kind of debating what to do, which makes sense. You have all these deliberations over what you're going to do. But what was interesting to me is in the movie, it seems like he's going to announce the decision he's going to make publicly on TV and radio. And it almost seems to imply that the people who are closest to him that he's been conferring with also don't know about the decision he's going to make until they see it publicly as everybody else does. Is it true that Kennedy made this decision and then revealed it publicly for the first time?
Yeah, what's interesting about how he's almost absorbing everything. He's not making concrete decisions on anything. He's hearing arguments, from one side and the other, and just back and forth. The one particular scene, as I mentioned, Curtis LeMay, and this actually takes place in the book. It's recorded and they really do a great job of it in the film, where JFK and LeMay have that famous exchange where he meets with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the 19th of October, and LeMay makes the quote, "You're in a pretty bad fix here, Mr. President." And then Kennedy does that slow turn. He goes, "What'd you say?" He goes, "You're in a pretty bad fix." And Kennedy responds, "Well, just in case you didn't know, you're in it with me." And that actually did happen. So LeMay, his attitude was, that bomb them back to the Stone Age mentality. Let's attack them now. The Russians aren't going to do anything. And Kennedy, and there's that one scene where O'Donnell basically shields Kennedy from LeMay. It gives him that real stern look. So the decision to have the TV announcement is a major deal, because at that point, this is really going to be where we have all of this information. We are going to let the world know about it. And, this is where, again, things start to get pretty interesting, because when it comes to dictating Cold War policy and how both the United States and the Soviet Union will respond and interpret to each other's actions, the term blockade does imply indeed an act of war. And on the late evening of Thursday the 18th, he confers with McNamara, Gilpatrick Taylor, McGeorge Bundy, and others, his brother, Ted Sorensen, and having the awareness of what is going to happen. Kennedy will speak to the nation at 7:30 p.m. on the 22nd of October, 1962. So having long lived with the prospect and the knowledge of nuclear war and its unthinkable consequences, Americans reacted to Kennedy's words with alarm, but not panic. Everywhere, families were, you see in the film, stocking up on food, gasoline, other emergency supplies. I was not around during this time. My father tells me about it. He reminded me of the duck and cover days where American school children were subject to these nuclear drills, diving under desks in the classrooms in the event of an exchange. Reservists were being prepared for call-ups in homes and in bars. Television watchers saw the footage of airplanes taking off, troop trains moving tanks and soldiers. So the atmosphere of tension was pervasive. And all through the night, analysts of the National Photographic Interpretation Center and elsewhere in the intelligence community anxiously await the scrutinized intelligence indicator of any Soviet military activity in response to Kennedy's speech. Now, while they saw Soviet and Cuban forces being brought up to a higher state of readiness, they detected no real apparent developments in the field preparing for any type of large-scale move against Berlin or, say, Turkey, for example. So the blockade is announced, and with it in place, the Russian vessels are now underway and under heavy surveillance by the U.S. Navy, with their aerial and seaborne assets now gathering intelligence. So Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had ordered his missile ship-carrying vessels to turn around no more than 24 hours before the morning of October 23rd. And after Kennedy gives his nationwide announcement that the discovery of missiles in Cuba and the imposition of a quarantine around the island, according to Soviet documents and shipping records, Khrushchev only permits 5 ships already close to Cuba to proceed. So since these ships were only a few hours from sailing time to the closest Cuban port, there was little risk that they would be intercepted by warships. So you have the Alexandrovsk carrying nuclear warheads to Cuba, its escort ship, the Alamatrix, which arrives in the port of La Isabela at dawn on October 23rd. 3 other ships, the Divignorsk, the Dubno, and the Nikolaevsk. The Soviet leader ordered 4 submarines into the area with nuclear torpedoes to remain in the vicinity of the quarantine line. Ships and oil tankers carrying non-military equipment were also authorized to head to Cuba. So the closest ships to the quarantine line, the Kimovsk and the Gagarin, as McNamara points out, according to Bobby Kennedy, the U.S. Navy makes contact with both ships at 10:30 and 11 a.m. Washington time on the 24th.
Okay, so just because the movie does mention briefly that it's a quarantine, but we can't call it a blockade because blockade would be an act of war. But everybody really knew what was going on. Would that be a fair interpretation?
At this point, and that's the thing too, that there's so much tension, and obviously you had the language barrier. So any sort of miscalculation, misstep, any kind of action that may be perceived as an act of war. I mean, there are instances with the Russian submarines where one of the captains lost contact with his communique in Moscow and thought World War III was starting, didn't know what to do. One of his subordinates actually made him surface and say, okay, we need to really think if we really want to launch these missiles right now. That is a theme that plays out before the missile crisis and after, in the decades after, that there are so many times throughout the course of the crisis where there are nuclear accidents, aircraft that are carrying nuclear weapons, they're disintegrating in the sky. The nuclear weapons are being scattered all over the place. Some we still can't find today. I know there's I think a hydrogen bomb that's still buried in the mud off the coast of Georgia somewhere that was lost, I think, by, I think, a B-52 or a B-47. So when talking about I would say the most iconic quote from the Cuban Missile Crisis appears in a Saturday Evening Post retrospective in the weeks afterward, describing the confrontation between the blockade line between U.S. warships and the missile-carrying freighters. Rusk will say on October 24th, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked.
It's just again, historically, it's a different mindset of times where it's just things are so. I mean, they call it a crisis for a reason, but just to think of how many times things can go wrong, and it starts. I mean, once it starts, right? I mean,
there's, Kennedy makes the quotes that, there's always going to be some dumb bastard that doesn't get the message or the order, and that's true. And you figure LeMay would be this type of person that the Joint Chiefs seem to have their own agenda, that they're walking down the hallway saying, these damn Kennedys, they don't know what they're doing. We need to do something fast before this gets out of control. So you're trying to control people who want to do something completely the opposite of what you're trying to do. And to maintain that posture and that discipline of, statesmanship, of negotiation, the art of negotiation, I would say, between the superpowers is really born out of these 13 days. Because if you put Kennedy and Khrushchev side by side, they are polar opposites in every which way, shape, or form. And to be able to, to find a middle ground it would seem almost impossible. But this would obviously play out further as Kennedy makes that first major move. And I'll sort of give it a little bit of a hint of what comes later on. It's Ted Sorensen, and he is really the point man. He's not really a central character in the film itself. You do see him here and there. He has some scenes where he interacts with Kennedy, but by all accounts, his role in the missile crisis was much more pronounced than it was in the film. So he's actually the one that comes up with both versions of the speech: what quarantine blockade is going to look like, or what invasion and airstrikes going to look like. And he has that great quote where he says, I couldn't do the other one. I simply could not come up with it. And he was only able to do the speech that was, only geared towards, okay, we're going to try and do this the most diplomatic way and peaceful way possible. Sorensen couldn't bring himself to come up with the worst version.
Well, earlier we talked briefly about the Soviets denying the existence of missiles, and that topic comes back up after the speech. JFK's made this public speech, so it's public what's going on there. But in the UN, the ambassador Zorin from the Soviet Union tells the UN that the U.S. is pushing the world to the brink of war, but they have no proof of the missiles that they claim are there. And then there's all this tension from the American side because they think Adlai Stevenson, the American ambassador, isn't going to be able to stand up to Zorin. And there's all this extra tension that the movie adds there because of that. But then he does. He stands up to Zorin in the movie, and then he shows the photos of the missiles in Cuba that prove to the UN that the Soviet Union is escalating the tensions, not the U.S. And the way that this plays out in the movie, it seems to catch the Soviets off guard, and then it almost seems to turn the pressure of the world's nations that looked like they were more on the U.S. because everybody thought the U.S. was doing this, and then it seems to shift it over to the Soviet Union. Was there really a pivotal moment like this, like we see in the movie?
Yeah, and another important scene is where you see President Kennedy talking about the delegation, the Organization of American States. That was a particularly important. He needed their support unilaterally. He wanted unanimous. He makes it well known. I want a unanimous decision. He wants the entire support of the OAS. And this part is where the U.S. has the Soviets really more or less painted into a corner, because even before this, we see another important scene in the film which does take place. It doesn't happen in real life, where we see Ken O'Donnell speak to Commander William Ecker of the U.S. Navy, where they have the scene where they fly the two F-8 Crusader low-level mission, the photo reconnaissance over the island. So Ecker was the commanding officer of Photo Reconnaissance Squadron 62. So because of the top secret nature of their mission, Ecker's unit was ordered not to wear any insignia on the flight suit. Doesn't even have his name tag on the top of his pockets. So interesting piece of trivia for the film. The actor who plays Ecker in the film is played by the late actor Christopher Lawford. So Lawford should sound familiar. He's the son of Peter Lawford of the Rat Pack, of course. He was married to Patricia Pat Kennedy, who was JFK and RFK's sister. So he's the actual nephew of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. So the scene where we have Ecker and his wingman, Lieutenant Bruce Wilhelmy, take off on their RFA Crusaders on October 23rd, 1962, conducting the first low-level reconnaissance flight over Cuba, as you see in the film. Their aircraft take a series of photographs over one of the missile sites. So Ecker says that the movie took some minor liberties about the truth of his mission. As you see, they fly over and the Cubans throw up a pretty heavy volume of fire. He takes a couple of shots.
All the sparrows. They were just sparrows, right?
Yeah, those are sparrows. He goes, sorry, guys, it's just the way it is, right? So, and there's the scene where, there is some truth where Ecker says the moment of his adventure was depicted pretty accurately in the film. His top secret debriefing and the round table where he's escorted immediately after he lands to go talk to LeMay. They didn't even let him get out of the plane. They whisked him by limousine to the Pentagon room, to the tank, as it was called. We're recalling that Curtis LeMay, the head of course, the former strategic, of the head of the Strategic Air Command in the 1950s, he was upset that basically the Navy had upstaged the Air Force in obtaining these critical photos. And later, when Kennedy awards Ecker's squadron with a presidential citation, LeMay was reported to be in the back of a limousine, pouting and chomping on his cigar and refusing to participate. So that was what Ecker's version of it was. But that mission that takes place over Cuba was significant at the end of the day. It gives Ambassador Adlai Stevenson the photographs that he will use, taken by Ecker at the United Nations, as proof that the USSR has installed nuclear ballistic missiles in Cuba, and this would eventually turn opinion against the Soviet Union. So Edward Martin, who is the Assistant Secretary of State of Inter-American Affairs, then seeks a resolution in support for the Organization of American States. Adlai Stevenson lays the matter before the UN Security Council. The ships of the naval quarantine line are now in place around Cuba. Soviet freighters bound for Cuba are now bringing supplies, are now stopping dead in the water, as you see in the film. But the oil tanker Bucharest continues towards Cuba. And in the evening, Robert Kennedy meets with Ambassador Dobrina in the Soviet embassy. So talking about Adlai Stevenson, he literally calls himself out as a coward in the beginning of the film. Remember, he kind of goes completely the opposite and says, well, we should offer a deal to end the crisis. And Kennedy says, oh, no, there's no way we can do that. So we later see him at a sort of political mixer where he talks to Ken O'Donnell and then later has a conversation about early in the evening and says, I basically call myself a coward in front of the whole room today. So from the outset, Stevenson really establishes himself as the most consequential and unacknowledged and unappreciated advisor. There were people simply saying, he's not up to the task. We need to get somebody else in there. Yeah, Bobby Kennedy on the phone saying, okay, we're going to get ready to basically come out, take the cane and yank him off the stage and get somebody else up there to take over for him. So he had a reputation of preferring to concede rather than to confront. In the first days of the crisis, he was worried that his man in New York wasn't up to the task. And on Thursday, October 25th, on the 10th day of the crisis, Stevenson showed that he had the stuff, more sterner stuff than JFK initially thought. And the former two-time presidential candidate had effectively dressed down Valerian Zorin the Soviet ambassador and UN Security Council meeting as the Americans watched on television. Stevenson listened impassively, and there's that tension there. Come on, Adley, come on. And the Soviet ambassador continues to lace into the United States over and over again. And when it was finally his turn to speak, he dispensed with the standard diplomatic niceties. He instead went immediately for the jugular. I want to say to you, Mr. Zorin, I do not have your talent for obfuscation or distortion, confusing language, and your double talk. I must confess to you that I'm glad I do not. And Stevenson went on to denounce the Russians for lying, treating Zorin in a way that ambassador likened to the American prosecutor, browbeating a defendant, and then said, all right, sir, let me ask you one simple question, Ambassador Zorin. Do you deny that the USSR has placed medium and intermediate range missiles on the island of Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no. So there's that real instant there where the room is watching, they cheer, they say, yeah, way to go, Adley, and said, you can answer yes or no. You've denied they exist. I want to understand you correctly. I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, and it's your decision. So with Zorin still continuing to refuse to answer, Stevenson and his aides then proceed to put up Ecker's photos of the missiles in Cuba. The delegates in the room, or sort of the Russians, are saying, oh my goodness, what's going on? They and who knows if they even are aware of it. So that the Khrushchev would sort of hang a lot of his visors out to dry, not giving the whole picture of what's going on. So the mild-mannered Stevenson had an enormous political and diplomatic victory for the United States.
Even just the timing of it, happening in the 60s, it's not like word would travel as fast as it does now anyway. So, even if they weren't hiding something or that it could just be the time it takes for things to travel, they might not have known.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, that's the thing that's probably was the most alarming, is that we don't live in an age like we do now with you have everything in the world that the palm of your hand, and you can communicate anywhere in the world basically at a moment's notice. There was still delays, and there's that back and forth. We don't know how the Russians are going to interpret this this conversation or this move, and vice versa. So there's all these different what ifs and different scenarios. But I think Kennedy really, this is the point where we start to see, okay, we might have a real solid plan here that's going to actually work without World War III breaking out. And I think that's just the one of the key points is how Stevenson is just waiting. He's waiting, just letting them go through their whole diatribe about how we're escalating tensions and we're putting the world at risk of nuclear war, and then just here's the evidence, here's the proof, and we're going to be doing this for a little bit. And I like how he defers to the other. I forget which leader it was, but I think it was it was Panama.
Yeah.
It says, no, I give up all my time to the ambassador.
I yield my time back to the U.S. Okay, we're here. Yeah.
Love that. I absolutely love it.
Speaking of the communications and such, in the movie, there's something that kind of new and unexpected happens around this point. And the movie only really mentions his name is John in the dialogue. I looked at the casting. I think they were talking about John Scully. He's a ABC News correspondent. He arrives at the White House now in the movie, and he's telling the president and his advisors that he has a source named Alexander Fomin. And according to Scully, this guy, Fomin, knows the Soviet Premier Khrushchev personally. So JFK tasked Ken O'Donnell to go into the FBI validating this story. He's not able to find definitive proof in the few hours that he has. Everything's under a time crunch here. But O'Donnell tells President Kennedy of a possible connection between Fomin and Khrushchev from 1941 as war buddies. So that's enough. Scully meets with Fomin and tells him that the American government is open to guaranteeing that they will not invade Cuba in exchange for the missiles being dismantled. But then the two conditions that the UN has to inspect the missiles, not just taking their word for it, to prove that they've been dismantled. And then the deal has to be made in 48 hours. That's the other part of the deal. And then soon after this, we see that, a 10-page letter being sent from Khrushchev to Kennedy seems to be going around all of the official communication channels is going on behind the scenes here. And in that letter, he says that he'll remove the missiles in exchange for the no invasion pledge. And so it just had me curious about this communication going on behind the scenes. We're talking about this communication going on in a different time period. Did that sort of communication between Khrushchev and Kennedy actually happen the way we see it in the movie?
Yeah, it did. And it's interesting because there's this whole other dynamic. It's the world out on the streets of Washington, D.C. It's the world outside the White House and all of the major decision making, walking into a restaurant with a Soviet diplomat. So journalists at the time lived for scoops. Being the first to break a major news story is the ticket to journalistic fortune and fame. And if you're a journalist covering the biggest story of your lifetime and suddenly you become a participant, do you tell the world what you've learned, or do you sit on it? So ABC News diplomatic correspondent John Scully found himself in such a predicament on Friday, the 26th of October, 1962, on the 11th day. So Scully got a call shortly after noontime from Alexander Fomin. And Fomin was officially a diplomatic counselor at the Soviet embassy in Washington. His real job, though, was a KGB station chief in Washington. So his given name was Alexander Vexilov. And he had to also run Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenberg spy ring. So he wanted to have lunch with Scully, and he was just finishing a bologna sandwich. He was not inclined to eat anymore. But the urgency that he detected from Fomin's voice persuaded him that food wasn't the point of the phone call. So he agrees to meet at the Occidental restaurant located just a few blocks from the White House. So Scully immediately returns to his office at the State Department in the press room and jots a short memo summarizing what Fomin had told him. He gave the memo to Roger Hilsman, the director of the State Department Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Hilsman immediately recognized it as something of significance, then passes along to Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and then the secretary turns it on to JFK and Robert McNamara. So Fomin's offer to Scully came now as JFK was becoming increasingly pessimistic about the direction of the crisis and where it was headed. So the Soviet ships carrying missile parts had turned back, but there were still missiles in Cuba. More would become operational every single day. So the morning of the XCOM meeting, he had told his advisors the missile would come not only if the United States invaded Cuba or offered to trade removal of the missiles of something that the Soviets wanted. Now with Fomin's overture, he now had a possible way out of the crisis. So after Scully finishes his appearance on ABC News' 6 o'clock p.m. network broadcast, he doesn't mention anything about the lunch with Fomin. He was summoned to the State Department and ushered into Dean Rusk's office. The secretary pulled out a yellow sheet of legal-sized paper out of his pocket and began reading. And the gist of the message was that Scully should tell Fomin that he had been of the highest officials of the state government of the United States, that the administration saw possibilities in his offer. So Scully immediately arranges to meet Fomin at the coffee shop at the Statler Hotel, I should say, half a block away from the Soviet embassy. He would pass along the message, and after being convinced that Scully was leveling with him, Fomin had picked up the 30-cent cab fare for 2 cups of coffee that they ordered, and then the cashier continued talking to a friend rather than take the payment. The Soviet spy chief slapped a $5 bill on the counter and just disappeared. So it's just, like I said, there's this whole underworld out there in Washington, D.C., probably still exists, where there's negotiations going on behind the scenes. And as Scully relays his message to Fomin, the White House was now receiving a long and emotional letter from Nikita Khrushchev and confirming that the proposal of Fomin that had floated in the first place to Scully. So the letter was delivered to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow around 9:43 a.m. And that morning, Washington time, it had taken more than 11 hours to translate the letter and had the State Department brought to the White House. And it began Khrushchev's indignant defense of why the Soviet Union had sided with Cuba. And Khrushchev then shifts gears and then actually puts an offer on the table. So Kennedy as an advisor it really inferred from Khrushchev's and Foman's letter and their overtures that the Soviets were making a coordinated effort at this point to extend an olive branch. In fact, Foman was really, trying to initiate different developments and really hoping that this was going to break somehow. And JFK and his advisors were becoming more hopeful that a political resolution, a peaceful resolution, was now possible. Cuban leader Fidel Castro was becoming increasingly convinced that a U.S. invasion was imminent, and he had, no intention of backing down from the imperialists without inflicting major pain in return. And then he sends a letter to Khrushchev saying, "We need to attack the United States right now, first strike, and however harsh or terrible solution, there would be no other." So Castro also orders Cuban forces to fire on any U.S. aircraft which will enter Cuban's airspace, which we will see play out.
You have all of these things going on, and the movie does make a good point. There was I don't remember the exact line of dialogue, but there was something in there talking about how one of the advisors mentions to JFK how the Soviets lied about the missiles. So what about this letter? How do we know that this isn't just another ruse? They're trying to stall for time because again, they know that they're building these missiles, and the time is until these are ready for launch. So maybe they are just stalling for time. Do we know now of ways that Kennedy was able to authenticate this letter, or was he just mostly working off faith that this was real?
I think it was a little bit of both. I think by this point, Kennedy was, again, at the point of frustration. I think you start to sort of see his line of thinking start to say, okay, you know what? We might need to start considering that now that this window of time is closing, we're not sure what's going to happen. So this was a sort of glimmer of hope that I think Kennedy was really looking for at the end of the day. He was just waiting for any glimmer of, and they pushed that issue throughout the film. And even Bobby Kennedy, as I mentioned earlier, they're trying to push every single diplomatic solution available. And this letter comes across in the course, the relationship there with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev's response back. We now can see that Kennedy is able to effectively reach out to Khrushchev. It's almost as if you're dictating policy by doing things. So by this move you mean this. By doing that move you mean that. So all of these, as I mentioned earlier, interpretation of things, any kind of miscalculation. Everything was so just razor thin as far as the margin of error in the negotiations that were going on. As I mentioned, Castro's telegram to Khrushchev, Kennedy knew nothing about this. And as far as he could tell that Friday night, he now had a way out of the crisis that now served U.S. interests. And what he would discover when he awoke the next morning was that the crisis would enter its most dangerous day, the 27th, which was Black Saturday. And the decisions that he and Khrushchev made, more importantly, the events that neither man had anticipated nor controlled, would determine whether the world would go to the brink, go to war over the nuclear brink effect.
Well, you mentioned Saturday, the 27th, and that's about where we're at in the timeline of the movie. And as if things aren't escalated tensions, they escalate once again when the Americans get confirmation that the Soviets have deployed what they call frogs, Cuba, or short-range tactical nukes. And the belief is that they might be using this against an invasion force. They assume the U.S. is going to invade Cuba, and so this is the defensive there. But meanwhile, we also see that according to the movie at least, the Soviets have stepped up their work on installing the missiles. The first few have become operational already, and then the rest are going to be done within 36 hours. So, according to the movie, President Kennedy seems like there's no other choice, so he orders the airstrike to take place on Monday morning, followed by the invasion. And that means they only have a few hours left if they hope to reach a diplomatic solution. Did Kennedy actually order the airstrike and invasion like we see in the movie?
Yeah, as I said, there was that other, there was the one part that was, Kennedy was, okay, there's a little bit of hope for a peaceful solution to this, but I can't take my finger off the other option, which is, committing to total release. That On October 27th, Kennedy would approve McNamara's suggestion, calling into active duty 24 Air Reserve squadrons of troop carrier aircraft. These aircraft made it possible to airlift the first wave of the airborne invasion, considering about 34,800 paratroopers from Fort Bragg and Fort Campbell. They would be followed by surface movement of the 1st Armored Division and elements of 2 infantry divisions designated for further reinforcement if necessary. So what was called Op Plan 314 or Operations Plan 314 calls for the deliberate and coordinated invasion of Cuba, with the Marines landing on eastern Cuba or near Guantanamo, and the 18th Air Corps seizing airfields in and around Havana. And the amphibious phase of the operation would be controlled by Headquarters 2nd Fleet with Joint Task Force 122. So once these initial landings would be completed, Headquarters, the 18th Air Corps, and the would become a JTF, Joint Task Force Cuba, to control all further operations from that point on, to really facilitate the expected popular uprising against Castro. A separate joint unconventional warfare task force in the Atlantic would deploy special forces and other elements into Cuba. As I mentioned, this was the era, of course, they had the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School. Kennedy was really a firm believer in developing these elite units, like we see, the Green Berets, the SEALs, and so on. So these units involved remained on high alert into November and long after the public perception of the crisis had effectively disappeared. So this prolonged alert, like the prolonged preparation and prior to discovery of the missiles, indicates the seriousness which the administration had contemplated in attacking Cuba. So in effect, the U.S. Army had really prepared for a major war without mobilizing its reserve forces, an anomaly that was similar to the situation which would take place during the Vietnam War. So this high state of readiness was achieved at substantial cost, both in dollars and the long-term efficiency of services. The call for equipment and personnel to bring units into strength had depleted the Army's school system. The Army never received the authority to extend soldier enlistments or recall reservists, although McNamara granted such authority to both the Navy and the Marines on October 27th. So overall, we have the Kennedy would eventually start to sort of, plan for the worst, but not quite rule out, there still might be some hope, holding out hope that this quarantine and this is going to work somehow. It's already showing that it is, that there are already Russian ships that are not really getting close to the quarantine line, turning around. And of course, you're going to get those, you're going to still pass through. So there's still very much the tensions that day. And then, of course, we have what happens later on with the incident over Cuba with Major Rudolph Anderson.
That leads right into the next question about Major Anderson, because in the movie, again, this is on Saturday the 27th, according to the movie, too, and that's when the first casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs. Mention his name, Major Anderson. He's piloting a U-2 spy plane at some 72,000 feet, according to the movie, when we see surface-to-air missiles getting launched, and he tries to evade them, but they end up hitting his plane and breaks up in the air. So if we were to believe the movie's version of history, this is the first casualty that we see in the crisis. Is that true?
Yeah, it is. And as I mentioned earlier, the U-2 spy plane was, a major leap forward in terms of, aerospace technology. It was, the brainchild of Clarence Kelly Johnson of Lockheed. And the U-2 itself was meant to be avoid detection, avoid, surface-to-air missiles, avoid, any kind of defense, capabilities whatsoever. So Rudolph Anderson does indeed become the first casualty of the crisis when his U-2 is shot down. Anderson was actually not scheduled to fly on this day, but he lobbied hard for the assignment when the mission was added to the schedule. So it was mission 3127, which was Anderson's 6th mission over Cuba. Wow. As a part of Operation Brass Knob, which would be the most dangerous yet. And now what's occurring is you have the Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile operational and now seemingly war was going to be imminent. And the SA-2 itself, which many pilots during the Vietnam War will find out, is a deadly, deadly missile. It's basically like someone basically firing a telephone pole at you. It's coming at you, multiple times the speed of sound, and it's got a deadly, deadly range. So, of course, as soon as the USAF U-2 approached Cuban airspace, it was detected and tracked by Soviet radars and assigned the designation Target 33. So, together with their commanders, operators nervously monitored this aircraft as it progressed, crossing from the island from a northwest to a southeast axis, and feeding all this real-time information and reports to several surface-to-air missile sites that were now on full combat alert. So right from the start, the Soviets knew that the high-flying intruder was neither innocent nor alone. Their work, in turn, was also being tracked by one of the United States Air Force's RB-47H aircraft of the 55th Wing, just also coordinating with the crew of the USS Oxford. So this was a surface ship airplane operation, not just this one U-2 flying by itself. There's a lot that goes into these missions. So just the presence of the U-2 and the RB-47H did not escape, the attention of Soviet radar. So Anderson would steer his U-2 over Guantanamo Bay after continuing to a more westerly direction, and a fact that will become crucial what happened next. This would now bring him directly into the course of a Soviet unit equipped with the SSC-2, a Salish cruise missile, deployed outside the village of Filipinas. And the FKR-1 missile were deployed with also 12 kiloton nuclear warheads meant to neutralize the U.S. base of Guantanamo in case of an invasion. So because the missiles were moved into position during the night of October 26th and the 27th, their presence could not have been revealed by earlier reconnaissance flights. So the fact that Major Anderson overflew the area in question was arguably one of the main reasons why the Soviet commanders ordered their units to fire and shoot down his U-2. So the U-2 itself, because it was meant to fly at high altitude to avoid detection and missiles, the SA-2 was the perfect missile to bring the U-2 down. If you see the U-2, if you notice, pilots of the U-2 are almost wearing spacesuits. They are flying really at the edge of the atmosphere, and the U-2 itself, with a long wingspan, was not an easy airplane to fly. It's actually still in service today, but it's as really bicycle landing. You have to have monitors driving their cars and trucks to monitor the U-2 and talk to the pilots to make sure the wings don't hit the ground. So it's a tough plane to fly from takeoff to landing. So having flown over Guantanamo, Anderson tries to fly in a northwesterly direction, and intending to fly over the island, he is constantly monitored. And of course, the missiles are sent up. And by all accounts, they say that a piece of shrapnel pierced the cockpit into Anderson's flight suit, depressurizing it, killed him instantly. And, the U-2 crashes. There was actually the wreckage of that plane is still on display in certain parts of Cuba.
What was it like? The tensions at that had to have been the highest point of the crisis, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have Kennedy is really, again, the invasion is on his mind. Which could take place within 24 to 48 hours. Then you have Rudolph Anderson, being down, and you have LeMay, Maxwell Taylor, and others saying, we need to go to war right now. And you have the incident where the threat level is brought to DEFCON 2, and Kennedy absolutely loses it. He brings Bobby and Ken O'Donnell into the to the Oval Office, and it's just completely he had a situation where we had a glimmer of hope for peace, and now this happens, and the pressure that must have mounted against Kennedy, and again he must have been physically and mentally drained by the time this happens. And of course, you have to now think, there's that scene where he looks out the window, he sees, Jackie and his kids out there playing with the other, and they're all thinking the same thing. This could be, the end of the world. And the answer that they would be waiting for would come 24 hours later. That Sunday, the world will be pulled back from the brink of war with less than 24 hours to go before American airstrikes are set.
Wow, which is just one of those things you can hear it, but it's still hard to wrap your head around just how close that was. Throughout the movie, there were a couple things that made me think maybe they're doing it for Hollywood timing, because we see some military tests going on. It seems like the absolute worst time. There's a hydrogen bomb detonation above Johnston Island in the South Pacific that we see happening. There's a missile launch test at Vandenberg Air Force Base, another test that happened. Were there any other things outside of the crisis that happened that just, had to have immediately increased tension? You see a missile launch. How do you know that that's actually a test as opposed to just a launch, right?
Yeah. So it just so happens, and just to make things even worse, that, of course, nuclear tests have been going on since the end of the Second World War. Of course, Russia detonates their first atomic bomb in 1949. So since the end of World War II, the United States and Russia had been conducting nuclear weapons tests, with Russia, of course, in 49. Both nations engage in an arms race, with nuclear weapons stockpiles increasing into the hundreds and soon thousands of nuclear bombs, whether tactical nukes, cruise missiles, multiple independent reentry vehicles, either launched from missile bases, aircraft, or submarines. So you can basically miniaturize or maximize these weapons to great effect, as we see with the footage of the test flights and the preparedness flights and nuclear tests. So on August 30th, 1961, Nikita Khrushchev announces that the Soviet Union will break from the 3-year moratorium and resume nuclear testing. So 2 days later, they started an unprecedented series of atmospheric nuclear tests, including the detonation of a 50-megaton device. So subsequently, President Kennedy decides that the nation must resume atmospheric nuclear testing, and approved what's known as Operation Dominic, which is the largest nuclear testing operation ever conducted. It takes place from April of 1962 all throughout the year into the Cuban Missile Crisis and beyond that. So this was just, everyday stuff. I know this is going on, but we're just going to test, fire a nuclear weapon. And beginning in April of 1962, Dominic was a series of 36 nuclear tests, with the majority of these tests being 29 airdrops by B-52 bombers. So 3 of the tests took place during the crisis. So these weapon development tests went to evaluate the advanced designs in the labs that have been cooking up for all these years and the moratorium and beyond. So the 2 tests of the operational weapon systems were conducted. The Polaris submarine-based launch ballistic missile and the anti-submarine rocket. So during the crisis itself, the U.S. will detonate a 1.59 megaton bomb called Chamo over Johnston Atoll on October 18th. Checkmate is detonated over Johnston. On the 20th, the Soviet Union will detonate K3. On the 22nd, at the height of the crisis, the U.S. will detonate 2 more nuclear devices, Bluegill, Triple Prime, and Calamity, on the 26th and 27th of October, respectively. So the Soviets then respond with another detonation of K4 on the 28th. And the megatons are going up and up into the hundreds at this point. So it's almost as if both nations' nuclear weapons were doing the talking in some way, shape, or form. Okay, you have this. Okay, we have this. And just this back and forth. So heeding to this wake-up call in the following months, both parties, alongside the United Kingdom, continue negotiations on banning nuclear testing. And with the comprehensive banning of nuclear tests on the table, only a partial ban could be achieved, owing to the pressure from the military establishment on both sides. So the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty bans nuclear testing above ground, in the atmosphere and outer space and underwater, but not underground, I should say. So you could almost make the argument that as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the continued nuclear tests that were going on simultaneously, you had to back away and say, okay, this could have really gone astray, and a detonation here. Oh, we're going to war. So it could have been that easy to sort of make that miscalculation.
Which throws another whole other bit of historical context to what you were talking about earlier when talking about how Kennedy had to continue with his normal schedule, and everybody has to continue with the normal schedule because you don't want the public to know yet. But part of that public schedule is also doing these tests that might say some things you don't want to say to the opponents on the other side, right?
Yeah.
That just adds another whole other level of tension that we haven't even talked about. That was there.
And as if the whole situation with the missiles being the warheads being placed on them, and the Russian submarines with nuclear weapons, of course the Americans there too, and obviously the downing of Major Anderson's U-2, and then of course the detonation that takes place all throughout. It's a miracle. It really is, and and even to go further beyond into the Cold War years, I remember there was an instance in 1983 where a Soviet operator on a console detected the launch of nuclear missiles from the United States and was just seconds away from launching. So
isn't that the War Games movie? Wasn't there a movie about that kind of thing?
Yes, with Matthew Broderick, I believe, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's like I said, there are the way things played out, and the way that Kennedy's just tactful decision making, and just to give him so much credit. You see in the film how much pressure he is under, and just again the physical and mental toll you see really towards the end of it had to have been considerable. And I guess if you really think about the end of the day, it also damages relations between Russia and Cuba. That Castro wants to go to war. He wants to make the first strike. He wants Soviet backing behind him. And when the Russians begin pulling away, he's saying, wait a minute, what happened? We had this whole idea we're going to keep these missiles here, and with the Bay of Pigs, and this could happen again. So it really cooler heads prevail, and thankfully for all of us that this takes place.
Movie focuses mostly from the American side, so we don't get a lot from the Soviet side. But you did mention earlier the Jupiter missiles, and that's a part of it. We'll get to kind of how the movie shows the whole thing coming to an end. But what were things like from the Soviet side? Because as I was watching the movie, I got the impression that, okay, one of the big reasons why the United States wants the missiles out of Cuba is because they can destroy so many people so quickly. But I also got the impression that the United States is basically doing the same thing in the Soviet Union with missiles in Turkey that could pretty much kind of do the same thing that we're seeing over here. So can you give us an overview of what things were like on the Soviet side that we don't even see in the movie?
So things were much different on the Soviet side. The Soviet Union reacted very differently. So for Americans, especially during World War II, it's for the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's a unique crisis because for the first time in their history, they realized that we could be destroyed completely. We didn't worry about this during World War II. We had oceans on either side of us. None of our cities were bombed. Our industries continued to produce the material and weapons we needed to win the war. So for the Soviet people, they had their own war experience. For them, it was no different. There was no panic in the streets of Moscow. Life went on as usual. They experienced threats many times throughout their history, going back, to the times of the Mongolian invasions, during the time of, in the post-Roman world and in the early part of the Middle Ages, where you have Western Asia was a flurry of activity from outside context. You have the Vikings, the Magyars, the Germanic tribes, and so on. You have fast forward, you have the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. President Theodore Roosevelt has to preside over the negotiations to end that conflict. Then you have World War I, where Russia is forced out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And you have, of course, the Russian Revolution of 1917 taking place. And then Stalin enters the picture. You have the Great Terror. You have the purges from 1936 to 38. Then, of course, World War II, where Nazi Germany breaks from Molotov-Ribbentrop and invades the Soviet Union in 1941 with Operation Barbarossa. So the worst fighting of World War II takes place in Russia. they suffered the highest amount of casualties in the war, estimates between 8 to 10 million soldiers and around 20 million civilian deaths. And Russia will account for about a third of all of the losses in all of World War II, which is staggering. So the Russians' misconception was sort of their own reality. The enemy at the gate, the missiles at your borders, like anything, this is all a part of their historical experience. So Europeans had enemies at the gates for all their time of history. American bases that surrounded now the Soviet Union, and when Americans would place missiles bases in Turkey and any other European country, it didn't create any panic because the obligation of the government was to deal with the opposite side. It was expected that they were going to take a firm stance on any sort of potential threat. So again, the Americans, we were lucky. We enjoyed the isolation, and Americans were basically scared of everything as a nation. And I would compare the Americans at this time as a sort of a tiger that grows up in the zoo and then just released into the jungle. So they really didn't have any kind of conception. World War II was distant. Pearl Harbor was off in the middle of Hawaii, didn't touch the mainland. And with Russia, again, it's that constant threat that we're going to be destroyed or conquered was really their mindset.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense as to why I was so treated so differently, for sure. Yeah.
Different circumstances, and again, I would even say it's still continuing, of course, with Russia and Ukraine being engaged in this war for years now, and there's no sign of it studying. Let's say North Korean troops are going into the fight now, so they're just a country that's used to strife and conflict. They're used to going out, whether it's regaining territory from the old Soviet days, or defending themselves from the Nazis, or whatever the conflict was. They're just a nation that is used to having to defend itself at all costs.
Yeah, which is not something we're so used to here in the homelands of the United States. That's for sure. Well, at the end of the movie, we see Ken O'Donnell driving Bobby Kennedy to the Soviet embassy in the middle of the night. And when they get there, there's the smell of, you can't smell it in the movie, of course, but there's the smell of smoke and dimension in the air because the Soviets are burning documents in anticipation of war. And we see Bobby Kennedy talking to the Soviet ambassador, Dobrynin. He tells the ambassador that the president is willing to accept the deal in Khrushchev's first letter. In other words, in exchange for the Soviets removing the missiles in Cuba and submitting to the UN inspection to verify that's done, the U.S. will publicly promise not to invade or help any other nation invade Cuba. And the U.S. will also remove, we just mentioned those, the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. That's part of the deal as well. Although Kennedy says that they'll have to do it privately about 6 months later. They don't want it to look like it's happening right away. But they'll have the answer by tomorrow, Sunday, according to the movie. And the answer comes, Khrushchev agrees, so the world is pulled back from the brink of war with less than 24 hours to go before the American airstrikes are set to commence. How well does the movie do showing the way the Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end?
So as President Kennedy suspected, the missile crisis had turned a decisive corner, but it was not over. Weeks of secret, often tense negotiations would follow until a complete Soviet and U.S. Understanding was made on November the 20th. So President Kennedy's position remained sort of awkward through the last sort of days of October, led to believe that the crisis was essentially over. Reporters expected that they were going to be seeing evidence of the missiles being pulled out of Cuba. So the government really had no such evidence to release. So Kennedy had really little to go on, except his own belief that Khrushchev was indeed being sincere. And that belief was reinforced by intelligence of both, as I mentioned before, Cuban and Chinese anger of what they saw was regarded as a Soviet betrayal, that they had were pumping themselves up. We're going to be, with like the ultimate counter to the United States. We're the biggest superpower. We're going to develop more nuclear missiles, and we're going to be the big tough, leader of the communist world. And of course, you have China going communist in 1949, and of course, Cuba in 1959 as well. So there's this mounting communist threat that's existing abroad, and it would really take more intense negotiation and communication between Kennedy and Khrushchev. On October 28th, Khrushchev would send a private message to Kennedy, again, trying to nail down the deal on the withdrawal of the Jupiter missiles. So this is really a good sort of lesson in statecraft and statesmanship, and even brinksmanship, if you want to sort of term it that way, that the Cold War was really overall marked by these series of events. By you have the Berlin crisis, then you have the Berlin blockade, the Berlin airlift, and then the Berlin Wall goes up, and there's all these different phases of what of course we're well within the Soviet zone of occupation, right face to face with the Russians, and it's this divisiveness, and again the criticism that's leveled at Kennedy that he can't handle it. And I think what this demonstrates is that his decision-making was critical. May have saved the world. I would say in many ways he probably did, because you think about it, at any given day, say one day you're feeling this way, the next you're feeling this another way, and someone tells you this and someone tells you this, and you're thinking, okay, how am I going to formulate a reasonable conclusion? How am I going to make a sound decision here? And you have guys like LeMay and Taylor and Rusk and McGeorge Bundy and McNamara. All of these guys are just and of course your flesh and blood brother Bobby is there right with you. And I was actually I was surprised to see and read how much of a role he had as the Attorney General. He really, I'd say in many ways, didn't get really a whole lot of credit for really the credit he deserves, because he was putting himself out there, wanting to go out and meet with the Soviet delegation and try and nail down a solution, because he really felt that I think in a lot of ways that the brothers both felt that they had to sort of make up for the legacy of their father in a lot of ways. And again, there's that Munich exchange, that look they have, and there's the referencing to it. I think in a lot of ways they want to reverse course and say, no, we're not going to be appeasing. We want to try and find a diplomatic solution to this issue, because we don't have any other choice. The other choice is the world goes to nuclear war and it's all over. We're not going to have tomorrow to think, oh, maybe we shouldn't have made this decision. So Kennedy, again, I get his presidency was for the short time that it lasted, he did a lot of things, a lot of important things, and I was surprised to see towards the end. And in the end of the crisis, some of the phone calls he makes, they're kind of surprising. I'll sort of tell you about that in a moment.
Are you open to doing a what if question about that? Because I'm curious about that. As I was watching the movie, I got the sense that JFK, Bobby Kennedy, and then of course Ken O'Donnell, and those are the kind of the three people who repeatedly seem to be pushing back against. You mentioned some of the military leaders there, and in the movie, we see them pushing like, oh, we need to go to war. We need to launch these airstrikes and do that. And of course, we know from history that JFK was assassinated about a year and a month later in November of 1963. So I can't help but wonder, what if JFK had not been president? Maybe LBJ, or I guess anyone else really that you could throw in there. But do you think the Cuban Missile Crisis would have ended differently if JFK was not president?
That's a great question. Because I said, everyone has different attitudes, tolerances, thresholds. Interestingly enough, although the film doesn't show it, and it's in the book, The Kennedy Tapes, and again, there's the transcripts of the conversation, Kennedy would leave the ExComm meeting on the 28th, that Sunday at 12:08 p.m. And he does this a couple of times prior, but he would place a call to former President Dwight Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, of course, knows all too well the complexities of the U.S.-Russia relationship, especially during the height of the Red Scare during his presidency. Of course, Sputnik takes place, the U-2 and Francis Gary Powers. So Kennedy would brief Eisenhower on the results of the preliminary agreements between himself and Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Kennedy's literal response to Eisenhower's critique is one of agreement. And Eisenhower seems to agree with Kennedy's decision-making, which I'm sure had to be reassuring for the young president to get such affirmation from someone like Eisenhower, who was no stranger to making hard decisions, not only during those difficult, intense years of the Cold War during his presidency, but, of course, as his exemplary leadership as Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. After he hangs up with Eisenhower, he then calls former President Harry Truman, who was 78 years old at the time. And Truman, also well-versed in the art of Cold War strategy, being really the first president to experience it at the end of World War II. He also expresses his relief in telling Kennedy, "I'm pleased to death with the way those things turned out," quote unquote. And like the Eisenhower call, it was brief. So he's almost looking for affirmation, like validation, I would say. Like, my predecessors, did I make the right decisions here? After he hangs up with Truman, he then calls former President Herbert Hoover, who is 88 years old at the time. Hoover is also pleased to hear the good news about the events, telling Kennedy, this represents a good triumph for you. So I think this is a good example of the type of person and the leader that John Fitzgerald Kennedy was. He knew his history. He would quote, in the film Sun Tzu, The Guns of August, he was well aware of what each of his predecessors had experienced during their respective presidencies. So to answer your question, I think if any one of Kennedy's predecessors, even Richard Nixon, who was, of course, Eisenhower's vice president, ran against Kennedy in the 1960 election, he understood the realities of the Cold War. He was a great statesman who knew the art of strategy and policy, negotiation and deal-making. So it takes a great deal of diplomacy to deal with the complexities, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Lyndon Johnson, I'm not sure. he, but again, he was vice president, with Kennedy. He was in the room. I was surprised that when I was reading the book, he would kind of chime in here and there when only really asked. Kennedy was really more focused on his strategies. Lyndon Johnson was kind of like a sidebar, if you will. So as I mentioned earlier, the overwhelming consensus between JFK's advisors, between Robert McNamara and Ted Sorensen, actually will say that Ken O'Donnell was not the central figure throughout the crisis. So I looked even more into it and found out something interesting about the film. So Kevin O'Donnell, who is Ken O'Donnell's son, who was a venture capitalist and actually would buy back controlling interest of the production company Beacon Pictures in 1999, he denied the influence on his father's character or any portrayal of that. So there's always that sort of speculation of whether his influence put Ken O'Donnell at the forefront, but by all accounts and what McNamara and really and Rusk and others said, that Ted Sorensen was really the guy. He was the point man. He was the one writing the speeches that Kennedy was going to tell the nation. So Sorensen was really the guy that didn't get quite the credit that he deserves, and not so much Ken O'Donnell. Sadly enough, Ken O'Donnell would succumb to the effects of alcoholism at the beginning of 1977. After Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, he joined with Robert Kennedy. They were very close, and when Robert was assassinated in June of 1968, he just couldn't bear it. It was just he had become just completely enmeshed in the Kennedy's life, into Camelot. He was right there at the center of things. But it's sadly, it doesn't end well for him. So interesting is that he's not really the focal point of the movie. That's kind of why I gave it just a B, not really a B plus or an A. If maybe they would have put Ted Sorensen as the central guy, maybe a different story. But I think throughout the end of the day, it's an important film in terms, especially nowadays, where we're talking about the escalation of tensions in the Middle East, of course, and Russia. In terms of the historical context, it's the closest we've ever come to nuclear Armageddon. And the lessons we learn from this crisis, in spite of our differences along ideological lines, political lines, etc., cooler heads can prevail. John F. Kennedy had plenty of critics during his presidency, but I think he proved a lot of those doubters wrong with his handling of the crisis. So if we would have attacked Cuba, there was the likelihood that Russian personnel would have been killed as well, which would have easily spiraled out of control. And just an interesting note with the film itself, Kevin Costner actually traveled to Cuba in 2001 to screen the film for Fidel Castro. And Costner would say it was an experience of a lifetime, being able to sit a few feet away from Castro and seeing him relive these events as a young man. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Huh? Did he? You mentioned how what he thought of it. If he thought
he thought it was good.
Really?
He did like the film. Yeah, I mean, obviously he wasn't portrayed in the film, but he agreed and in certain points disagreed with some of the things that happened. But overall, I think in terms of the that particular thing that Costner did, which I thought was great. Just you don't think about it. Oh, why would we do that? They're communists, blah blah. This is how you break down the walls of division between nations. This is what we do here in the United States, and exposing people to the things, how we interpret things, that we can break down differences in spite of our different our beliefs and thinking this way, you think this way. So I think that was a nice little sort of postscript that I read about the film that Costner, was good enough to do that. I think it was a pretty poignant thing to sort of end the the legacy of the film with that, because it's important. And I think the film does a great job on showing exactly the sequence of events and really, for the most part, how they played out.
Yeah, and I mean, it's end of the day, it's talking to other people. I mean, regardless of whether or not you agree with them. But I think it's what happened in the movie too that we saw with Khrushchev being like, okay, we just got to let's just talk to each other directly. Khrushchev and Kennedy talking to each other directly. I mean, through letters, but directly as you could in the 60s, right?
Yeah. So it was the interesting thing about both leaders. Obviously, Kennedy would lose his life in Dallas in November of '63. And there's always that speculation of the what if, what would Vietnam would have happened. Kennedy was talking about not really wanting to get involved there. We already committed troops there. There were operations going on there. So of course LBJ then takes over, and then the course, really the worst of what had happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis had passed. And once Vietnam begins in 1965, that becomes the unfortunate legacy of not only Lyndon Johnson's presidency, but in a lot of ways, Kennedy's old advisors, McNamara being probably the most prominent. Johnson will keep, Kennedy's cabinet, even Robert Kennedy, and they do not like each other whatsoever. That's fairly well documented. So the key to Khrushchev, and I think in a lot of ways, the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis for him, it weakens his position considerably, because as I mentioned, this upsets the Cubans, it upsets China. It's for the first time that the U.S. and the Soviets are right here, and the Soviets back off, and that we hold firm with the blockade and removing the missiles, making the deal to make that happen. And this upsets many in the communists on the party lines. And in 1964, Nikita Khrushchev will be forced from power. And that will, in many ways, many historians will say that the Cuban Missile Crisis will be one of the primary reasons why that happens, and that he basically loses power and influence. And, you have, I believe it was two more leaders who come in. I think both of them die. And then Leonid Brezhnev comes in there.
Well, thankful that those what if scenarios did not turn out as bad as they could have been. Let's put it that way. It could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, it really could have been. I mean, especially a guy like LeMay. LeMay's reputation, they used to call him bombs away LeMay. He wanted war. And if you would have given him the green light, there would have been B-52s and every other asset just leveling and laying waste. And you have that kind of commitment, that kind of attack take place. Again, you're going to kill Russians on the ground. There are advisors there. They're not just dropping the missiles off on the island and saying, okay, telling the Cubans, you can put them together. We're going to go. No, they're on the ground. They're advising the technical data. They have to teach them how to use these missiles, how to load the warheads. And it's a complicated process. And again, if you're attacking the island in mass like that, you're going to have Russian casualties. And that was even the concern in the Vietnam War, that we would, in a lot of ways, limit strikes to the north because, there were Russians, helping bring in surface-to-air missiles and other anti-aircraft and different military technology into the region. And there was that concern. I think Lyndon Johnson said it, God forbid one of our pilots drops a bomb down the smokestack of a Russian freighter, we have a bigger problem on our hands.
Yeah, you start that trigger of treaties that World War I, basically.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show to chat through 13 days. I know we've been talking about the 60s today, but if I recall, last time we talked, you were working on an article about World War II. But can you share a bit about what you're working on now and where listeners can learn more about your work?
Sure. So, I mentioned last time I have an article about the attack. It's a smaller aspect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's the attack on the Marine Corps base at Everett Field on December 7, 1941. That is on the editor's table, hopefully be coming out in spring in World War II magazine. And I mentioned to you earlier that I had just come back from a recent trip to Gettysburg and a trip to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Just got into the early phases of two new projects I'm working on. One about my uncle's service in the Vietnam War. He was with H Troop, 17th Cavalry, the 198th Infantry Brigade, 23rd AmeriCal Division. That's a mouthful. And my great-grandfather, who was in World War II, who fought with the 70th Infantry Division, they got there just at the end of the Battle of the Bulge and into the surrender of Germany at the end of the Second World War. So I'm also working on a book that I'm collaborating with another author on. It's going to be about more so aviation and kind of getting into my love affair with aviation, I grew up with and still love it, and how it's pretty much impacted my life and military history and stuff. So a lot of good stuff coming up in the next couple of months.
Fantastic. And I'll add links to those in the show notes. Thanks again so much for your time, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me on. Great to have it.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. Thank you once again to Joshua Donohue for helping us separate fact from fiction in 13 days. Josh mentioned a bunch of his new work, and while not all of it is available yet, check out the show notes because as soon as it is available, I'm going to be adding those links. And in the meantime, I've got links to some of his previous work there as well. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1. President Kennedy ordered a halt of all U.S. nuclear tests during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Number 2, White House conversations were recorded and used for the book the movie is based on. Number 3, Kennedy and Khrushchev really did communicate outside of official channels. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the answer right here in the envelope, so let's open this up and find out which one is the lie here. And the lie is number 1. As Josh explained, because the way the Cuban Missile Crisis began, and it really meant the only highest levels of the U.S. government knew what was going on, that didn't include the U.S. military going about their normal business of the time. And part of that normal business of the time in the 1960s was doing nuclear tests. Josh told us of 3 nuclear tests during the Cuban Missile Crisis that only escalated the tensions even more. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're on the video version of this. As a solo podcaster, these episodes would not be possible without the support of Based on a True Story producers. And if you're watching the video version of this, we'll have the credits roll at the end, so I would encourage you to stick around for those. And if you want to get your name in the video credits for the next episode, you can learn how to do that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/producers. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Josh and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.